The moldy crust of 3-day-old bread felt like sawdust against Elinora Vale's cracked lips as she forced herself to chew each painful swallow, a reminder of the gnawing emptiness that had become her constant companion. Her stomach contracted violently, cramping with the familiar agony of prolonged hunger, and for a moment, her vision blurred from weakness. She pressed her back against the alley wall behind Morrison's general store, clutching the flour sack that contained all her worldly possessions and Tommy's tiny leather shoe. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Tommy's final words whispered through lips too dry to form proper sounds. "Ellie, I'm so cold. When will Mama come back?" He had been delirious by then, his 3-year-old mind unable to understand that Mama and Papa weren't coming back from the Clearwater mine cave-in. She had held him as his breathing grew shallower, watching helplessly as starvation claimed the last of her family. "Not today," she whispered to the empty alley, her voice hoarse with determination. "I won't let hunger win again." Through the bakery's rear window, golden loaves sat cooling on wooden racks, their rich, yeasty aroma drifting through the morning air like salvation itself. She had been watching Mrs. Kowalski's routine for days, noting when the woman stepped into the front room to serve customers, leaving the back door momentarily unguarded. Elinora's bare feet made no sound against the bakery's worn floorboards as she slipped through the rear entrance. Her trembling hands closed around 2 loaves, their warmth seeping through her torn sleeves like a benediction. She stuffed them into her flour sack with desperate efficiency, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she feared it might give her away. Mrs. Kowalski chose that moment to return from the front room, her arms laden with fresh rolls for the cooling racks. The older woman's eyes met Elinora's across the dim interior, and something strange flickered across her weathered face. Not quite surprise, not quite anger, but a complex mixture of emotions that seemed to war with each other. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Mrs. Kowalski's mouth opened as if to speak, her gray eyes taking in Elinora's skeletal frame and desperate condition. The woman's hands trembled slightly, and she seemed to struggle with some internal decision. Then the moment shattered. "Hans." Mrs. Kowalski called suddenly to her husband in the front room, though her voice lacked the urgency one might expect. We have a problem back here." But Elinora was already moving, bursting through the rear door into the harsh morning sunlight of Cold Creek's back alley. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Kowalski's voice rise, "Thief! Someone stop her! She's taken our bread!" The sound of heavy boots thundered across the bakery's wooden porch as Sheriff Amos Bridger emerged into view like an avenging demon. His massive frame filled the doorway, 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and malice wrapped in a badge that had lost all connection to justice. The Colt revolver at his hip cleared its holster with deadly precision. "Stop right there, you worthless piece of trash." Bridger's voice carried the authority of a man who had never met resistance in Cold Creek, echoing off the adobe walls like the roar of an angry god. "I'll put a bullet in your spine and drag you back by your hair." Elinora's legs pumped frantically as she rounded the corner into Millwright's alley, her torn skirts catching on her ankles with each desperate stride. The flour sack bounced against her hip, the stolen bread's warmth a cruel reminder of what she had risked everything to obtain. Her lungs burned as she gasped the thin desert air, her malnourished body already approaching the limits of its endurance. 20 yards behind her, Bridger's boots pounded against the packed earth with mechanical precision. The sheriff had built his reputation on moments like this. Brutal pursuits that ended with broken bones and public humiliation demonstrations of power that kept Cold Creek's population properly terrified. As Elinora reached the mouth of the alley, her shoulder collided hard with something solid and immovable. The impact sent her reeling backward, and she found herself staring up at a stranger who seemed to have materialized from the morning shadows. The man stood just over 6 feet tall, his lean frame carrying the kind of weathered toughness that spoke of years spent under an unforgiving sun. His hat was pulled low over eyes the color of winter storm clouds, and several days' worth of dark beard covered his angular jaw. Everything about him suggested long roads and hard choices, from his dust-covered boots to the way his hand rested casually near his holstered weapon. "Easy there, miss," he said, his voice carrying a gentle drawl that seemed oddly out of place in Cold Creek's harsh atmosphere. "No need to run yourself into the ground." This was Morgan Pike, though Elinora couldn't know that his presence here was far from accidental. 3 weeks earlier, in a smoke-filled saloon in Tucson, Morgan had listened to two cattle drovers discuss Cold Creek's sheriff in voices heavy with fear and disgust. "Bridger's got the whole territory sewn up tight," one had muttered into his whiskey. "Him and that banker Whitmore, they've got a system. Sheriff terrorizes folks until they abandon their land. Then the bank snatches it up for nothing and sells it to railroad interests for 10 times what they paid." The other drover had nodded grimly. "Heard tell of a family up near Prescott that got the same treatment. Whole clan just vanished one night after their boy started asking too many questions about land sales. Some say they moved on. Others reckon they ain't moving anywhere ever again." Those words had struck Morgan like lightning. For 4 years he had been tracking a network of corruption that had cost him everything he held dear. In Kansas, similar tactics had been used to clear his homestead for railroad development tactics that had ended with his wife Sarah and son Jacob murdered in cold blood by men wearing badges. "Where did she go?" Bridger's voice boomed from the alley entrance, growing closer with each word. Morgan assessed the situation in seconds, and the girl's desperate condition, the sheriff's predatory approach, the familiar pattern of the powerful crushing the powerless. Without conscious thought, he shifted position to block Bridger's line of sight. "She went down toward the church sheriff," Morgan said, pointing confidently toward Elm Street. "Moving like her tail was on fire, heading for the old cemetery." Bridger's pale eyes fixed on Morgan with immediate suspicion. The sheriff had survived this long by trusting nobody and questioning everything, especially helpful strangers who appeared at convenient moments. "Who the hell are you, and what's your business in my town?" Bridger's tone carried enough menace to make lesser men step backward. "Morgan Pike, sir. Came in on the morning stage from Tucson." Morgan kept his voice respectful but steady. "Looking for work, heard there might be opportunities for someone with mining experience." The sheriff's gaze lingered on Morgan's calloused hands and sun-darkened skin and the unmistakable marks of a man who had spent years working with his hands. After a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Bridger grunted acknowledgement and thundered past in pursuit of his quarry. Morgan waited until the sound of boots faded before turning back. But Elinora had vanished as completely as morning mist. Only a few breadcrumbs scattered in the dust marked where she had been. Within the hour, Sheriff Bridger had assembled his hunting party with the efficiency of long practice. 6 men whose loyalty could be purchased with silver or enforced through fear gathered in the town square, their faces bearing the hard lines of those who had done questionable things for money. Deputy Walt Henderson checked his rifle with professional competence. While his wife Martha watched from their store window, her expression troubled in a way that seemed oddly personal. Most terrifying of all were the tracking dogs, 3 blue-tick hounds, whose scarred muzzles and murderous temperaments perfectly matched their master's disposition. The pack leader, a grizzled male called Brutus, bore the claw marks of a mountain lion encounter that had only increased his viciousness. These animals had been trained not merely to track, but to corner and hold their prey until human hunters arrived to finish the job. The dogs picked up Elinora's scent near the bakery's rear door and began their hellish chorus voices rising in bloodthirsty harmony that echoed off Cold Creek's adobe walls. Townspeople who heard the sound crossed themselves and hurried indoors, understanding from bitter experience that Sheriff Bridger's hunts rarely ended well for anyone unfortunate enough to be the quarry. Morgan shadowed the posse at a careful distance, employing every skill he had acquired during 4 years of investigation and pursuit. He stayed well back from the main group, using abandoned buildings and rock outcroppings to remain undetected while keeping the hunters in sight. Patience had become his greatest weapon during his long quest for justice. Patience and the understanding that premature action could destroy months of careful preparation. Elinora's trail led away from Cold Creek's familiar streets toward the broken Badlands where geological violence had carved a maze of arroyos and mesas from the desert floor. This was killing country terrain that could claim the life of anyone unprepared for its hidden dangers. Loose shale crumbled without warning beneath unwary feet. Hidden sinkholes could swallow horse and rider alike, and the maze-like geography could trap travelers in circles until they died of thirst under the merciless sun. The heat was already building despite the early hour rising from the red rock formations in shimmering waves that distorted vision and made distance judgment treacherous. Morgan could read Elinora's desperation in her erratic trail. The stumbling footprints, the places where she had stopped to rest against shaded rock faces, the increasing signs of exhaustion as her malnourished body reached the limits of its endurance. The tracking dogs led Bridger's posse to the collapsed fence line that marked the boundary of some long-abandoned grazing claim. Rusty wire had once stretched between weathered posts, but time and weather had reduced the barrier to scattered remnants. The wooden posts themselves remained their tops splintered and sharp as broken bones from years of exposure to wind and sand. Dark stains on the weathered wood told the story of Elinora's passage. She had climbed over, despite the razor-sharp splinters that tore at her palms and forearms, leaving traces of her blood like a trail of breadcrumbs for her pursuers to follow. The sight of those crimson drops seemed to excite the dogs even more, their baying reaching a fever pitch of anticipation. Beyond the fence lay the skeleton of the old millwright sawmill, a collection of rotting timber and rusted machinery that had been abandoned when the local timber played out 5 years prior. The structure sagged like a dying creature, its roof partially collapsed and its walls gap-toothed from missing boards. Desert weeds had grown up through the floorboards, and pack rats had established colonies in the shadowed corners where the sun's heat could not penetrate. From his concealed position behind a cluster of weathered boulders, Morgan watched through his field glasses as Elinora slipped through a gap in the mill's foundation, like a ghost seeking sanctuary. The girl moved with the desperate grace of someone who understood that discovery meant death or worse. The hounds arrived minutes later, their voices rising in a cacophony that seemed to shake the very air. Brutus went nearly mad with bloodlust scratching at the foundation stones and baying with such intensity that his voice cracked from the strain. The sound was enough to freeze a man's blood, a primal noise that spoke of the ancient covenant between predator and prey. Sheriff Bridger dismounted with the satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his quarry. His weathered face bore the cold smile of a man who genuinely enjoyed his work and the expression of someone who found pleasure in others' terror and pain. "Come out of there, you worthless little rat," he called, his voice carrying easily in the thin desert air. "Come out now, and maybe I'll make it quick. Stay hidden in that hole, and I'll let the dogs tear you apart piece by piece. They haven't been fed today, and fresh meat always makes them friendlier." From his hiding place beneath the mill's rotting floorboards, Elinora could hear every word with crystal clarity. The dog's baying seemed to penetrate her very bones, and she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, while fighting waves of nausea brought on by fear and exhaustion. Her stomach cramped viciously, a reminder that she hadn't eaten anything substantial in days. Morgan's mind raced through possibilities, discarding plans as quickly as he formed them. 6 armed men plus the tracking dogs made direct confrontation suicide. But confusion and misdirection might create the opening Elinora needed to escape if he could execute his plan without being detected. His opportunity lay in careful observation and distant memory. During his morning reconnaissance of Cold Creek, he had noted the morning delivery to Morrison's general store, several barrels of lamp oil stacked carelessly near the loading dock. The petroleum smell had been strong enough to notice from 20 yards away, suggesting the containers were overfilled or poorly sealed. Working his way carefully to a position roughly 400 yards from the mill, Morgan drew his rifle and took aim at the first barrel. The distance required precision shooting, but years of practice had made him deadly accurate at ranges that would challenge most men. His first shot struck the largest container dead center, rupturing the wooden staves and sending lamp oil cascading across the store's loading platform. The second shot, aimed at the metal fixtures holding the other barrels, struck sparks that ignited the spreading petroleum. The explosion that followed could be heard for miles, a whoosh of flame and heat that sent a pillar of black smoke climbing into the morning sky like a signal fire visible from neighboring counties. But Morgan wasn't finished. Moving quickly to a different position to avoid detection, he put 2 more shots into additional oil barrels behind the hotel, creating a second explosion that sent even more smoke billowing skyward. The combined conflagrations made it appear that half of Cold Creek was going up in flames. To Sheriff Bridger and his men, focused as they were on their cornered prey, the explosion seemed to signal a catastrophe in the heart of town. The sheriff's head snapped toward the rising smoke columns, his face twisting into a snarl of frustration and indecision. "Goddamn it to hell," he snarled. "Henderson, take Morrison and Daniels. Get back to town and find out what the devil's happening. Could be an accident, could be someone trying to burn us out while we're busy. Either way, we can't let the whole town go up in smoke while we're chasing one scrawny thief." As 3 members of the posse rode hard toward Cold Creek, Morgan noted the sheriff's reaction with professional interest. Bridger was clearly a man who maintained control through constant vigilance, always ready to respond to threats against his authority or the corrupt system that enriched him. This psychological insight confirmed Morgan's assessment and provided valuable intelligence for what was to come. The distraction worked perfectly. While the remaining men watched the smoke and debated whether they should abandon their hunt entirely, Elinora slipped from her hiding place and sprinted toward a cluster of stunted juniper trees that offered the next available cover. She moved with desperate speed, understanding that this might be her only chance to escape the trap that was slowly closing around her. By the time the remaining dogs detected her movement and resumed their baying, Elinora was already disappearing into the labyrinth of canyons that stretched toward the horizon. Sheriff Bridger's curses echoed off the canyon walls as he realized his quarry had escaped his rage, crystallizing into something far more dangerous than professional duty. "And that little bitch has made this personal," he snarled to his remaining men. "We'll track her to hell itself if we have to." The pursuit resumed with renewed fury as the sun climbed toward its merciless zenith. Elinora's desperation drove her deeper into the wilderness, following ancient game trails and dry creek beds through terrain that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to venture into its embrace. Her small store of water, contained in a dented canteen she had found weeks earlier, was exhausted before noon, and by early afternoon her lips had begun to crack from dehydration. The surviving tracking dogs, still locked onto her scent despite the confusion at the mill, drove her relentlessly through a maze of red sandstone formations and thorn-studded vegetation. Each time she thought she had gained a moment's respite, the distant sound of baying would reach her ears, forcing her onward when her body screamed for rest. At one point, desperation drove her to scramble up a narrow chimney of rock, wedging herself into a crevice barely wide enough to accommodate her thin frame. The dogs arrived minutes later, going nearly mad with frustration as they tried to follow her scent up the impossible slope. For precious minutes, she was safe, but the position was a trap as much as a refuge. Eventually, she would have to come down, and the dogs would be waiting. Only when the sound of their baying faded into the distance did she dare to emerge, her hands and arms scraped raw from the rough rock. Blood from a dozen small cuts mixed with her sweat, creating stains on her torn dress that would make her easier to track when the dogs returned. Behind her, the posse had regrouped and was methodically following her trail with the patience of experienced hunters. Sheriff Bridger had divided his remaining men into pairs, sending them along parallel routes to prevent Elinora from doubling back or finding refuge in the maze of canyons. It was a professional manhunt executed with efficiency that spoke of years of practice. But the desert itself began to work against both hunter and hunted as the afternoon progressed. The temperature climbed past 105 degrees, turning the rock formations into furnaces that radiated heat like the forges of hell. Mirages shimmered on every horizon, creating false oases that could lead desperate travelers in circles until they died of thirst. Morgan, maintaining his careful surveillance from a distance, watched as first one and then another of Bridger's men began showing signs of heat exhaustion. The horses were suffering even more, their heads hanging low as they picked their way across terrain that seemed actively hostile to all life. Only Sheriff Bridger himself appeared unaffected by the brutal conditions, his determination burning hotter than the desert sun. As the day wore on, Elinora's strength began to fail more noticeably. Her trail became increasingly erratic, showing places where she had stumbled or fallen, where she had stopped to rest against any available shade. The combination of heat thirst and exhaustion was taking its toll, and Morgan realized she couldn't maintain this pace much longer. The crisis came at a dry creek bed where flash floods had carved a temporary oasis months or years before. A few stunted cottonwoods provided blessed shade, and the sand showed signs of moisture beneath the surface. Elinora had stopped here to dig desperately for water, her bloody fingers clawing at the earth in search of even a few drops of precious liquid. It was here that the dogs nearly caught her. Brutus and his pack arrived while she was still digging, their triumphant baying announcing the end of the chase. The lead hound launched himself at her with jaws spread wide, yellowed fangs, seeking her throat with predatory precision. Only a desperate grab for a fist-sized rock saved her life. The stone caught Brutus across the muzzle with enough force to stagger him, buying her the seconds she needed to scramble up the creek bank. But the other dogs were closing in, their eyes bright with bloodlust as they sensed victory. Elinora threw rocks with desperate accuracy, catching one animal in the ribs and sending another yowling with a bruised skull. But she was weakening with each effort, and the dogs seemed to sense her growing exhaustion. It was then that Morgan's rifle spoke from a concealed position 300 yards away. The bullet didn't hit any of the dogs. He was too skilled a marksman to miss accidentally, but struck the ground near Brutus with enough force to spray sand and pebbles across the pack. The animals scattered in confusion, their courage evaporating in the face of this unexpected threat. By the time they regrouped and resumed their pursuit, Elinora had vanished again into the maze of rock formations that characterized this part of the desert. But Morgan could see that she was reaching the end of her endurance. Soon, very soon, thirst would drive her to take risks that would prove fatal. That moment came as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. The memory of cool, sweet water finally overcame Elinora's caution, driving her back toward the edges of civilization, where a horse trough or well might offer salvation. The pump behind Mackenzie's livery stable represented everything she needed. Water to ease the fire in her throat shade, to rest her burning skin, and proximity to town, in case she could find some other means of escape. If she could reach it during the quiet hours of late afternoon, when most people sought shelter from the heat, she might fill her empty canteen and slip away unnoticed. But Sheriff Bridger understood the psychology of desperation better than most men. He had positioned himself in the shadows behind the stable like a spider waiting in its web, knowing that thirst would eventually drive his quarry to him. As Elinora approached the pump with desperate caution, moving from shadow to shadow like a ghost seeking salvation, Bridger's iron grip closed around her wrist with the finality of a steel trap. The impact of being slammed against the stable's adobe wall drove the breath from her lungs and filled her vision with dancing spots. "End of the line, you worthless little cunt." He snarled, his voice thick with satisfaction and something darker. "Thought you were clever, didn't you? Thought you could make Amos Bridger look like a fool in front of his own town?" The flour sack fell from Elinora's nerveless fingers, splitting open to scatter the stolen bread across the dusty ground like broken dreams. But something else tumbled from the sack as well, something that made her cry out in anguish as it rolled toward Bridger's boots. Tommy's tiny leather shoe lay in the dust between them, worn smooth by countless nervous touches and stained with tears shed in darkness. The sight of it lying there, defenseless and forgotten, broke something inside Elinora that all of Bridger's threats had failed to touch. Bridger's eyes fixed on the shoe with predatory interest, and his cruel mouth curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Well, well, got yourself a baby hidden away somewhere, do you, stealing bread to feed your bastard brat?" "No." Elinora whispered, her voice breaking as she stared at her brother's shoe. "Please, no. He's dead. My little brother Tommy. He was only 3 when the hunger took him." The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, carrying months of suppressed grief and guilt. "I tried so hard to keep him alive. I gave him everything I could find, every crust, every scrap. But it was never enough. He got so thin I could count every rib, and his eyes. God, his eyes got so big in his face, like he was asking me why I couldn't fix him." Her voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to echo in the stable's dusty interior. At the end, he was too weak to cry anymore. He just lay there making this little sound like a hurt bird. His last words were asking when Mama and Papa were coming home. I couldn't tell him they were never coming back. The truth of her loss hung in the desert air between them, raw and terrible in its honesty. But if Elinora hoped for mercy from Sheriff Bridger, she had fundamentally misjudged the man before her. "Andrew, dead baby, live baby, bastard baby makes no damn difference to me," he said with casual brutality that chilled the air. "Theft is theft, and I aim to make sure every worthless piece of trash in this territory understands what happens when you cross me." From his concealed position behind the stable, Morgan Pike witnessed this exchange with growing horror and rage. The truth hit him like a physical blow. This girl, barely more than a child herself, had not stolen out of greed or criminal intent. She had been trying to prevent another death, like the one that had shattered her world and left her carrying her brother's shoe as a talisman of unbearable loss. More than that, Morgan recognized in Elinora's story an echo of his own tragedy. Different circumstances, different perpetrators, but the same fundamental injustice, corrupt officials serving the interests of wealth while the innocent suffered and died. Her desperate theft wasn't a crime, but a symptom of a system designed to crush the vulnerable beneath the weight of others' greed. As Bridger began dragging Elinora toward the town square, Morgan made a decision that would define the rest of his life. This time, witnessing would not be enough. This time, he had found something worth fighting for, not just evidence of corruption, but a chance to prevent the kind of tragedy that had already consumed his own family. The town square at sunset resembled something from humanity's darker ages, when public punishment served as entertainment for those who had grown numb to suffering. Sheriff Bridger chained Elinora to the whipping post, with iron shackles that had held dozens of other victims, the metal worn smooth by years of use, and stained with the blood of previous lessons administered in the name of law and order. Word of her capture spread through Cold Creek with the speed of wildfire, drawing people from their shops and homes, with the eager anticipation of spectators gathering for gladiatorial combat. They brought their children with them, not to shield the young ones from cruelty, but to ensure they understood what happened to those who dared challenge the established order. Martha Henderson emerged from her general store, wiping flour from her hands on her apron as she joined the growing crowd. Her weathered face bore an expression of distress that seemed oddly out of place among the eager spectators. And she kept glancing toward the shadows, where Morgan had positioned himself among the onlookers. "Shameful business, this," she murmured to her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, speaking just loudly enough for Morgan to hear. That poor child driven to such desperation by circumstances beyond her control. Makes a person wonder what kind of community we've become when we allow such suffering in our midst. Mrs. Patterson sniffed dismissively, her thin lips compressed into a line of moral superiority. Crime is crime, Martha. Can't have people thinking they can just take whatever they please regardless of their circumstances. But Martha Henderson's eyes found Morgan's across the crowd, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding that spoke of prior knowledge and shared purpose. It was then that Morgan realized he might not be operating entirely alone in Cold Creek. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can steal from honest, God-fearing folk. Sheriff Bridger announced, his voice carrying easily across the square. The law in Cold Creek is swift, sure, and without mercy for those who choose the path of crime. Several of the younger men in the crowd began throwing pebbles and small stones at Elinora, their aim deliberately poor to prolong the entertainment rather than cause serious injury. She bore their taunts in silence, her head held high, despite the tears that traced clean lines down her dust-streaked cheeks. There was something magnificent in her defiance, a core of strength that poverty and loss had been unable to break. As Sheriff Bridger turned to accept congratulations from banker Cornelius Whitmore, who had arrived to witness the spectacle wearing his finest suit and most satisfied expression, Morgan saw his opportunity. He approached the whipping post under the guise of joining the jeering crowd, but instead of adding to Elinora's misery, he used a small pick from his pocket watch to work at one of the chain links holding her wrists. The iron was old and had been weakened by years of desert weather and the struggles of previous victims. With careful manipulation, Morgan managed to compromise the link's integrity without making the damage immediately obvious to casual observation. "Listen carefully," he whispered so quietly that only she could hear over the crowd's noise. "When the storm comes, and there's a big one building on the horizon, pull hard against that weakened link. It'll break free. Head west toward Dead Man's Canyon. There's an old bridge there. I'll meet you on the other side." Elinora's eyes widened slightly, but she gave no other sign that she had heard him. Smart girl, Morgan thought. She understood the need for absolute discretion. The storm had been building all afternoon, though most of the townspeople had been too focused on the entertainment to notice the ominous signs. Dark clouds massed on the western horizon, like an advancing army, their bellies swollen with dust and debris rather than life-giving rain. The wind had begun to pick up as evening approached, carrying with it the distinctive scent of an approaching hayboob, one of the massive dust storms that could engulf entire settlements within minutes. These storms were a fact of life, or in the desert territories, natural phenomena that experienced frontiersmen learned to read like sacred scripture. Morgan had encountered them during his travels across the Southwest, understanding both their terrible destructive power and the opportunities they could create for those prepared to exploit them. Old-timers in the crowd began muttering uneasily and casting worried glances toward the darkening sky. They recognized the warning signs, the sudden drop in temperature, the way the light took on a strange, yellowish quality that made everything appear slightly unreal, the almost supernatural stillness that preceded the wind. Sensible folks were already heading for shelter, but the spectacle of public punishment held most of the crowd in place. "Storm's coming," muttered Jebediah Morrison, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Big one by the look of those clouds. Gonna be a real gully washer." But Sheriff Bridger was too focused on his victim and the political theater of her punishment to pay attention to meteorological warnings. "Let her stay chained there until morning," he declared to the crowd. "Give everyone in Cold Creek time to see exactly what happens to thieves who think they can challenge my authority." The storm struck with the fury of an awakening god. The wall of dust rose hundreds of feet into the air, blotting out the setting sun and transforming the familiar world into a seething cauldron of wind and flying debris. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, and loose objects began flying through the air like artillery shells fired by invisible cannons. People scattered in every direction, hands pressed to their faces as they stumbled blindly toward the nearest shelter. Visibility dropped to arm's length, then to nothing at all, as the world disappeared into a brown hell of swirling particles that stung exposed skin and filled lungs with grit that tasted of ancient stone and bitter earth. In the chaos that followed, Morgan launched himself at Sheriff Bridger with the accumulated fury of 4 years spent tracking justice across an unforgiving frontier. They went down in a tangle of fists and murderous intent rolling across the dusty ground as the storm raged around them like the breath of demons unleashed from hell itself. Bridger was no easy opponent. Years of enforcing his will through violence had left him strong, experienced, and utterly without scruple when it came to close combat. His meaty fists found Morgan's ribs with bone-jarring force, each blow accompanied by grunts of effort and satisfaction. The sheriff's knees sought vulnerable targets that could end a fight quickly, while his thick fingers clawed at Morgan's eyes with the desperate viciousness of a cornered animal. "You made a big mistake interfering with me, you son of a bitch." Bridger snarled through split lips, blood streaming from his nose where Morgan's elbow had found its mark. "I'm going to beat you to death and feed your corpse to the dogs." But Morgan fought with the desperation of a man avenging his family's murder. His blows powered by grief and rage that had been building pressure like steam in a boiler for 4 long years. His right fist caught Bridger in the solar plexus, doubling the sheriff over with a whoosh of expelled air that was lost in the storm's roar. His left followed immediately, connecting with the man's jaw, hard enough to spray blood and broken teeth into the swirling dust. They separated and circled each other like wolves, both breathing hard, both bleeding from cuts and abrasions inflicted by fists and flying debris. The storm made footing treacherous. Loose sand shifted underfoot without warning, and pieces of wood and metal flew through the air with lethal velocity. Meanwhile, Elinora gathered her remaining strength and pulled against the weakened chain link with everything she had left. Her muscles weakened by hunger, and exhaustion trembled with the effort, like violin strings stretched to their breaking point. But desperation lent her strength she didn't know she possessed, and the compromised iron finally parted with a sharp crack that was lost in the howling wind. As she stumbled free from the whipping post, Sheriff Bridger managed to break away from Morgan and claw his way to his feet. The man's face was a mask of blood and fury, his pale eyes blazing with murderous intent as he drew a wicked-looking knife from his boot. "Enough of this dancing around," he snarled, lunging forward with the blade aimed at Morgan's heart. "Time to finish what you started, you interfering bastard." Morgan threw himself sideways, feeling the knife's point tear through his shirt and scrape across his ribs with surgical precision. The wound burned like a branding iron, but it was shallow, a graze rather than a killing blow. His hand closed around a fist-sized rock, and he brought it up just as Bridger pressed his attack. The stone caught the sheriff across the temple with a sound like an axe biting into hardwood. Bridger's eyes rolled back in his head, and he staggered, the knife tumbling from his nerveless fingers to disappear into the swirling dust. For a moment, Morgan thought the fight was over, but Bridger's skull proved thicker than expected. The sheriff shook his head like a wounded bull and reached for his revolver, his movements clumsy but determined. "Stand still so I can put a bullet in your brain," he roared. His first shot went wide in the storm, the bullet disappearing into the brown hell that surrounded them. The muzzle flash lit his bloody features like a photograph, negative, revealing a face twisted by rage and pain beyond rational thought. His second shot found flesh, the bullet tearing through Morgan's left shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer blow. The impact spun Morgan around and sent him crashing to his knees, blood immediately soaking through his shirt in an expanding crimson stain. The pain was indescribable, white-hot agony that made his vision blur and his stomach heave with nausea. For a terrible moment, he thought he might lose consciousness right there in the storm, leaving Elinora to face Bridger's wrath alone. "Run!" he shouted through gritted teeth, struggling to his feet, despite the wound that felt like molten metal in his flesh. "Get to the bridge. Don't wait for me." They stumbled through the storm-lashed streets of Cold Creek, the wind threatening to lift them off their feet and dash them against buildings with every step. Flying debris, broken boards, roof, shingles, pieces of metal torn from signs and gutters became deadly projectiles that could maim or kill anyone caught in the open. Behind them, Bridger's voice rose above the storm's roar, calling for his deputies with the persistence of a man who had never admitted defeat. The pursuit led them through a nightmare landscape where familiar landmarks had been transformed into alien shapes by the swirling dust. Morgan's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel his strength ebbing with the blood that flowed down his arm. But he forced himself to keep moving, drawing on reserves of determination forged during 4 years of pursuing justice across hostile territory. Elinora stayed close beside him, her small hand gripping his uninjured arm with surprising strength. "Which way?" she shouted over the wind. "I can't see anything." "West," Morgan replied, orienting himself by instinct and the faint sensation of the wind's direction against his face. "Keep heading west. The canyon's that way, and the bridge is our only chance." They pressed on through the maelstrom, their progress measured in yards rather than miles. Several times flying debris nearly took their heads off a section of roof that whistled past Morgan's ear like a scythe blade, a broken wagon wheel that bounced off the wall beside Elinora's head, with enough force to crack the adobe. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, despite the storm's fury. Bridger had managed to rally at least 2 of his deputies, and their voices carried on the wind as they followed the trail of blood that Morgan was leaving in his wake. "They can't have gone far." Bridger's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "The bastards bleeding like a stuck pig find them before they reach the canyon." The wooden bridge that spanned Deadman's Canyon had been built during Cold Creek's more prosperous days when the silver mine was producing, and there were plans to extend the railroad through the territory. Now it stood as a monument to abandoned dreams, its timbers weathered to silver gray by years of exposure to desert sun and mountain snow. As Morgan and Elinora stumbled onto the bridge's eastern approach, with their pursuers closing fast. Despite the storm's concealing fury, Morgan realized they had run out of running room. The bridge was their only route across the canyon, but it would also trap them in the open where Bridger's guns could find them. "Keep going," he told Elinora, drawing his revolver with his good hand. "Get across to the other side. Don't stop no matter what happens." "I won't leave you," she replied with fierce determination. "We started this together, and we'll finish it together." They reached the bridge's center just as Deputy Henderson and another man emerged from the storm behind them, and their rifles raised and ready. Henderson squinted through the flying dust, trying to draw a bead on the fleeing pair. "Stop right there or we'll drop you both," he shouted, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Sheriff's orders." Morgan turned and fired his remaining bullets at the bridge's main support beam, the shots echoing like thunder in the confined space of the canyon. But the ancient wood, though weakened, refused to give way completely. The structure groaned and swayed, but held firm, its builders having constructed it to last. It was then that Elinora made a decision that surprised them all. Grabbing a loose piece of timber from the bridge's railing, she began attacking the secondary supports with desperate strength, her makeshift club striking the weathered wood with solid impacts that sent splinters flying. "Help me," she shouted to Morgan. "We can bring it down if we both try." Together, they attacked the bridge's structural weak points with everything they had left. Morgan used his rifle butt to hammer at joints and connections, while Elinora continued her assault with the piece of timber. Behind them, Bridger's men were advancing cautiously, their weapons trained on the pair. The bridge finally surrendered to their combined assault with a sound like the world-ending 60 feet of timber and iron crashing into Deadman's Canyon in a cascade of splinters and dust that could be heard for miles. Henderson and his companion found themselves stranded on the eastern rim, separated by a gap that might as well have been on the far side of the moon. But the collapse nearly claimed Morgan and Elinora as well. The bridge's western section, undermined by their desperate sabotage, began tilting toward the canyon floor with sickening inevitability. Only a final surge of adrenaline-fueled strength carried them onto solid ground as the remaining timbers followed their predecessors into the abyss below. They lay gasping on the canyon's western rim, Both of them battered and bleeding, both of them alive, against odds that should have killed them outright. Behind them, the storm was already beginning to weaken its fury, spent against the immovable bulk of the surrounding mountains. Across the canyon, Sheriff Bridger's voice carried on the wind like the howl of a frustrated wolf. "This ain't over, Pike. I know who you are now, and I know what you're after. You hear me? I'll follow you to hell itself before I let you destroy everything I've built." But for the moment, they were safe. Morgan and Elinora stumbled away from the canyon rim, seeking shelter from the dying storm in an abandoned mine shaft that offered protection from the wind and flying debris. The entrance was partially concealed by fallen rocks, making it invisible to casual observation, but providing a secure refuge for those who needed it. Inside, the mine lit only by matches from Morgan's rapidly dwindling supply. They tended to each other's wounds with strips torn from their clothing. Elinora proved surprisingly gentle as she cleaned and bandaged his bullet graze her touch, careful and sure despite her own injuries and exhaustion. "Will you tell me now?" she asked as she worked her voice soft in the mine's acoustic darkness. "Why you really came to Cold Creek? Why you risked your life for someone you'd never met?" Morgan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flickering flame of his match, while wrestling with memories that still had the power to bring him to his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and newer determination. "I had a family once," he said slowly. "A wife named Sarah who was sweeter than spring water and twice as precious to me as my own life. And a boy named Jacob, 5 years old, with his mother's eyes and a laugh that could make flowers bloom in the desert." The story came out slowly, painfully, like poison being drawn from an infected wound. He told her about their homestead in Kansas, about the corrupt officials who had coveted their land for railroad development, about the morning he had returned from town to find his wife and son murdered and his home reduced to smoking ash. The sheriff claimed they resisted arrest. Morgan continued, his voice growing harder with each word. "Said Jacob had pulled a gun on them, a 5-year-old boy with a wooden toy pistol. But I knew the truth. They were executed to clear the way for men who saw dollar signs where other people saw homes and families and dreams." Elinora listened in silence, her hand resting gently on his uninjured arm as understanding dawned in her eyes. "You've been hunting them ever since." "Men like them," Morgan corrected. "Corrupt lawmen who serve wealth instead of justice, who use their badges as licenses to steal and kill. I've been tracking them across half the frontier, building cases that will stand up in court and put them where they belong." He paused to light another match, and the flame casting dancing shadows on the mine walls. "Your situation in Cold Creek was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to expose Sheriff Bridger and his methods. But when I saw you with that baby shoe and I understood what drove you to steal that bread, it stopped being about evidence. It became about preventing another family from being destroyed by these bastards." "So you were using me," Elinora said, but there was no accusation in her voice, only understanding and perhaps forgiveness. "At first," Morgan admitted without trying to soften the truth. "But somewhere between the mill and the whipping post, it became personal. Not because of my case, but because you deserved better than what this town was prepared to give you." They spent the night in the mine shaft, sharing Morgan's meager supplies of water and jerky, while talking in whispers about loss and hope, about the possibility of justice in a world that seemed designed to crush the innocent. By the time dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, they had reached an understanding that went deeper than words. But their work in Cold Creek was far from finished. As the sun climbed above the canyon rim, casting long shadows across the storm-scoured landscape, Morgan led Elinora back toward town through the aftermath of meteorological violence. The desert looked like a battlefield, uprooted sagebrush, scattered debris rock formations, scoured clean by wind that had carried the force of 1,000 years compressed into a single night. "Where are we going?" Elinora asked as they approached Cold Creek's outskirts where buildings stood damaged but intact against the morning sky. To finish what we started. Morgan replied, checking his revolver and finding it loaded with the last of his ammunition. Bridger's office. There's evidence there. I've been waiting for the right moment to claim evidence that will bring down more than just one corrupt sheriff. The sheriff's office stood relatively intact, despite the storm's fury, its thick adobe walls having weathered worse violence than wind and sand could provide. More importantly, the building appeared to be empty. Bridger was presumably still trying to find a way across the collapsed bridge, and his surviving deputies were likely dealing with storm damage throughout the town. Morgan had been observing the office for days, noting Bridger's habits and routines with the patience of a professional investigator. He had watched the sheriff access a hidden strongbox on 3 occasions, always when the office was supposedly empty, and always with the furtive manner of a man concealing something valuable and incriminating. The strongbox was hidden exactly where Morgan had expected, behind a loose board in the sheriff's desk, secured with a lock that yielded to careful work with his pocket tools. But its contents exceeded even his most optimistic expectations, painting a picture of corruption so extensive and systematic that it took his breath away. There were contracts between Bridger and banker Whitmore, detailing their land acquisition scheme in meticulous detail, complete with lists of families to be targeted and properties to be seized. There were records of bribes paid and received, including substantial payments from railroad interests and mining companies that wanted troublesome residents removed from valuable land. Most damning of all was a signed confession from Whitmore himself, apparently kept by Bridger as insurance against betrayal or double-crossing. The document detailed their entire operation, from the systematic intimidation of poor families to the murder of witnesses who threatened to expose the conspiracy. But the revelation that made Morgan's blood run cold was contained in a separate folder marked Territorial Operations. Inside were reports and correspondence from sheriffs and officials across the Southwest, documenting similar land grab schemes in dozens of communities. Among them was a report from Kansas, a detailed account of a homestead clearing that had resulted in the deaths of a family who had resisted legal eviction. The names and locations were different, but the circumstances were identical to what had happened to Sarah and Jacob. Morgan realized with growing horror that Bridger's network of corruption stretched across multiple territories, encompassing a web of officials who had been systematically murdering families for railroad and mining interests. Sweet Jesus, he whispered, his hands shaking as he read document after document. They're all connected. Every corrupt sheriff from Kansas to California, all part of the same operation, all killing families for the same people. But there was more. Hidden at the bottom of the strongbox was a list of named townspeople who had been paid to participate in the scheme, either by providing false testimony against victims or by purchasing seized property at drastically reduced prices. Nearly every prominent citizen of Cold Creek was implicated, explaining their callous indifference to suffering and their enthusiastic participation in public punishments. Among the names was one that particularly interested Morgan: Martha Henderson, listed not as a participant, but as a potential asset to be cultivated. Notes in the margin indicated that Bridger had been trying to recruit her as an informant, offering bribes and making threats when she proved uncooperative. Armed with this treasure trove of evidence, Morgan and Elinora made their way to the Cattleman's Hotel, where Circuit Judge William Morrison maintained temporary chambers during his monthly visits to Cold Creek. They found the judge in his room reviewing case files over breakfast while preparing for what he assumed would be another routine day of frontier justice. Judge Morrison was a silver-haired man in his 60s, with the kind of stern demeanor that came from decades of sorting truth from lies in courtrooms across the territorial frontier. His reputation for integrity was well established throughout the region, making him exactly the kind of official Morgan had been hoping to encounter. Judge Morrison, Morgan said as he knocked on the hotel room door, his good arm cradling the box of evidence. I have documents that require your immediate attention, evidence of corruption that reaches into every corner of this community." The judge listened in growing amazement as Morgan presented the contract's confessions and correspondence, while Elinora provided her testimony about Bridger's methods and the systematic oppression she had witnessed. His weathered face grew darker with each revelation, and by the time they finished their presentation, his hands were trembling with barely controlled anger. "Great God in heaven," Judge Morrison muttered as he examined the signed confession and territorial correspondence. "The scope of this conspiracy. It reaches from here to Kansas and beyond. How long has this been going on? Based on these documents, at least 7 years." Morgan replied. "But I suspect the network has been operating much longer than that. This is just what Bridger was careless enough to keep in writing." It was then that Martha Henderson appeared at the hotel room door, her face bearing the expression of someone who had been carrying a terrible burden for far too long. She knocked hesitantly, then entered, when the judge beckoned her forward. "Judge Morrison," she said quietly, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. "I need to make a statement about what I've witnessed in this town, about things I should have spoken up about long ago." Morgan turned to her in surprise, but Martha's eyes held a look of weary determination that spoke of finally reaching a decision that had been long postponed. "I've been watching Sheriff Bridger's activities for over a year." She began addressing the judge directly, keeping careful records of his abuses and waiting for someone like Mr. Pike to arrive, someone with the knowledge and resources to expose the truth. She explained how Bridger had approached her months earlier, offering bribes in exchange for information about her customers and their financial situations. When she refused, the threats began subtle at first, then increasingly direct as the sheriff realized she could not be bought or intimidated. "He made it clear that my family's safety depended on my silence," Martha continued. "But after what I witnessed yesterday, after seeing that poor child chained in the square like an animal, I realized that silence makes me as guilty as active participation." She produced her own collection of evidence-detailed records of Bridger's activities, witness statements from terrorized families, even photographs of some of his victims after their encounters with frontier justice. Combined with the materials from Bridger's strongbox, it formed an overwhelming case against the entire conspiracy. "There's something else," Martha said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something that's been eating at me for months. 3 weeks ago, a stranger came through town, asking questions about land sales and missing families. A day later, his body was found in the desert, supposedly killed by Apaches. But I saw him talking to Sheriff Bridger the night before he died, and the sheriff wasn't happy about what he was hearing." Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression grave. "Are you saying Sheriff Bridger murdered this man?" "I'm saying the man was asking the same questions Mr. Pike has been asking," Martha replied. "And I'm saying that Bridger has never let anyone threaten his operation and lived to tell about it." Within hours, Judge Morrison had issued arrest warrants, not just for Sheriff Bridger and banker Whitmore, but for 19 other residents of Cold Creek who had profited from the conspiracy. The warrants were carried out by a detachment of federal marshals who arrived by telegraph summons, men whose loyalty could not be bought or intimidated by local corruption. The arrests sent shockwaves through Cold Creek as residents who had considered themselves untouchable found themselves in custody. The Methodist minister, the town doctor, even the mayor all had their names on Whitmore's payment lists. All had profited from the systematic oppression of their community's most vulnerable residents. Sheriff Bridger himself was captured while trying to flee on horseback, his mount foundering in the desert heat long before he could reach the territorial border. The sight of the once mighty sheriff being led back to town in shackles, his face bruised and his clothes torn, drew crowds of onlookers who had never imagined such a reversal was possible. Banker Whitmore's arrest proved even more dramatic. Confronted with his own signed confession and the detailed financial records, the man suffered what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown. He began blubbering out additional details in a desperate attempt to secure leniency, his admissions filling in the few remaining gaps in the prosecution's case. "Please, you have to understand," Whitmore begged as the marshals prepared to transport him to the territorial capital for trial. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Bridger said we were just helping the territory develop, bringing progress to backward places. I had no idea he was killing people who refused to cooperate." But his protestations rang hollow in the face of documented evidence showing his personal profits from each development project. While families like Elinora's starved in the streets, Whitmore had been accumulating wealth that would have supported hundreds of people in comfort. The most surprising arrest came when Mrs. Kowalski appeared at the jail, her weathered face streaked with tears as she confessed to her part in the conspiracy. "I knew that poor child was stealing from my bakery," she admitted to Judge Morrison. "I saw her coming around at the same time each morning, watching my routine, waiting for her chance. And I left the door unlocked on purpose." Morgan stared at her in amazement. "You wanted her to steal. I wanted her to eat." Mrs. Kowalski replied simply, "She was starving to death, and I couldn't bear to watch it happen. But I was too afraid of Sheriff Bridger to help her directly. He had made it clear what happened to people who interfered with his idea of justice." She explained how Bridger had been pressuring all the local merchants to report any suspicious activity among the town's poor, using theft charges as pretexts for the systematic removal of families whose land was coveted by railroad interests. "When I saw her take those loaves, I called out because I had to, because people were watching, and because staying silent completely would have made Bridger suspicious. But I never expected him to pursue it so viciously, to turn it into such a spectacle of cruelty." Her confession added another layer to the case against Bridger and his network, demonstrating how the corruption had infected every aspect of community life. Even acts of kindness had to be disguised as compliance with the sheriff's brutal system. For Elinora, vindication came in ways both expected and surprising. The townspeople, faced with undeniable proof of their complicity and the shame of their behavior, began approaching her with offers that went far beyond mere apology. Mrs. Patterson, who had thrown stones during the public punishment, arrived at the hotel with tears streaming down her weathered face. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said to Elinora, pressing a leather purse into the girl's hands. "But I want you to have this. It's everything I made from buying the Martinez family's land after Bridger ran them out of town. Blood money, and it belongs with you." Similar scenes played out across Cold Creek as residents struggled to come to terms with what they had allowed to happen. The Methodist congregation organized a collection that provided Elinora with enough funds to secure decent housing and proper clothing. The town doctor offered free medical care to address the malnutrition and chronic health problems she had developed during her ordeal. "It ain't about sudden kindness," explained Tom Morrison, the blacksmith, as he presented her with a carefully wrapped bundle containing tools she could use to start a small business. "It's about trying to live with what we became. About trying to be the people we should have been all along, instead of the cowards who let evil flourish because it was profitable." But perhaps the most meaningful gesture came from Mrs. Kowalski herself. 3 days after her confession and subsequent release, Judge Morrison had determined that her actions, while technically illegal, had been motivated by compassion rather than greed. The baker appeared at Elinora's hotel room with a proposition that would change both their lives. "I've been thinking." The older woman said, her accent thick with emotion and determination. "My Hans, he's getting too old to handle the heavy work at the bakery. And I need help from someone who understands what it means to be hungry. Someone who'll never let good bread go to waste or turn away a person in need." She paused, wiping flour from her hands on her apron, a gesture that had become automatic after decades of working with dough and ovens. "What I'm asking is this: would you consider becoming my partner? Not just an employee, but someone with a real stake in the business. Someone who can help me make sure that what happened to you never happens to another soul in Cold Creek. The offer was more than employment. It was a chance for Elinora to build a new life, doing work that had meaning beyond mere survival. She would learn the baker's trade earned partnership profits, rather than mere wages, and help ensure that no one in Cold Creek would ever again face the kind of desperation that had driven her to theft. "There's something else," Mrs. Kowalski continued. "Hans and we've been talking about expanding. There are smaller settlements in the territory that don't have proper bakeries, places where people are struggling just like you were. We could take bread to them, make sure nobody goes hungry just because they live too far from town." As for Morgan, his 4-year quest for justice had finally reached a resolution that exceeded his wildest hopes. The evidence from Cold Creek was being used to investigate similar corruption throughout the Southwest, potentially bringing down an entire network of officials who had enriched themselves through the suffering of innocent families. Federal investigators arrived within the week, armed with Morgan's documentation and the testimonies he had helped gather. They brought news that several sheriffs and judges across multiple territories had already been arrested based on the Cold Creek evidence, their own files revealing extensive connections to the land grab conspiracy. "Your work here has broken open the biggest corruption case in territorial history," Marshal James Kellerman told Morgan as they stood in what had been Bridger's office, now converted into a temporary federal courthouse. "We've got enough evidence to prosecute 36 officials, maybe more. The railroad companies and mining interests that funded this operation are scrambling to distance themselves from the whole mess." But perhaps the most satisfying news came from Kansas, where new evidence had led to the arrests of the men directly responsible for Sarah and Jacob's murder. The sheriff who had killed Morgan's family was facing charges of murder conspiracy and racketeering crimes that would likely result in a death sentence. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, Morgan said quietly as he read the telegram announcing the arrests. "Sometimes it just takes longer to build a case that can't be ignored, bought off, or swept under the rug." Yet, as the wheels of justice turned and the guilty faced their reckoning, Morgan found himself confronting an unexpected question: what came next? For 4 years, the pursuit of justice had been his entire existence, the driving force that got him out of bed each morning and kept him moving when exhaustion and despair threatened to stop him. Now standing in the cemetery where Elinora knelt beside 4 small graves, her parents and little brother Tommy, finally having proper markers, plus a memorial stone for all the other victims of Bridger's corruption, Morgan realized that his wandering days might finally be coming to an end. "What will you do now?" Elinora asked as she arranged wildflowers on Tommy's grave, her voice carrying the kind of peace that comes only from closure and the promise of a better future. "Now that you've found the justice you were looking for, I honestly don't know." Morgan admitted his gaze taking in the simple headstones and the young woman who had somehow become the center of his world. "For 4 years, hunting corrupt lawmen was all I could think about. It gave my life purpose when everything else had been taken away. Now that it's finished, I suppose I need to figure out what comes next." She stood and brushed the dust from her new dress, blue calico, with small white flowers, clean and whole, the first proper clothing she had owned since childhood. The transformation was remarkable. Regular meals had filled out her hollow cheeks, medical care had treated her chronic ailments, and hope had returned light to eyes that had been dulled by too much suffering. Mrs. Kowalski mentioned that her expansion plans would need someone with business sense and a head for numbers. Elinora said carefully, not quite looking at him directly, "Someone who could handle the financial side of things while she and I focus on the actual baking. The work wouldn't be exciting, but it would be honest. And it would mean making sure nobody in this territory ever has to steal bread to survive." Morgan considered this surprised by how appealing the prospect sounded after years of violence and pursuit. "I've got some money saved from my traveling days," he said slowly. Could be, we might really expand the operation, maybe establish regular delivery routes to settlements that don't have access to fresh bread. Could be. Elinora agreed, and there was something in her smile that spoke of possibilities neither had dared imagine just days before. There's something else we could do. Morgan added, his voice growing stronger with conviction. We could set up a fund use part of the profits to help people who are struggling the way you were. Make sure they don't have to choose between pride and starvation. A memorial fund, Elinora said softly. In Tommy's name, and in memory of your family too. As they walked back toward the town together, the setting sun painted Cold Creek's adobe buildings and wooden storefronts in shades of gold and amber that made everything look clean and new. The community looked the same as it had a week before, but everything fundamental had changed. The atmosphere of fear and systematic cruelty had been lifted, replaced by something that might eventually grow into genuine community and mutual care. Behind them, Sheriff Bridger's office stood empty and dark, its windows reflecting the sunset like dead eyes. But ahead lay the warm glow of Mrs. Kowalski's bakery, where honest work waited, and the aroma of fresh bread promised that tomorrow would bring something immeasurably better than what had come before. The stolen loaves that had started it all lay long forgotten, their crumbs scattered by desert winds that had blown the evidence of that desperate act into the vast emptiness beyond Cold Creek's borders. But their theft had accomplished something far more valuable than feeding a hungry belly. It had exposed the rot at the heart of an entire system of oppression and created the possibility for something better to grow in its place. In the end, the smallest acts of desperation sometimes produce the greatest transformations. And justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it just needs the right moment, the right witnesses, and the right people willing to step forward when stepping back would be safer and more profitable. As Morgan Pike and Elinora Vale walked toward their uncertain but hopeful future, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, eternal witnesses to the truth that had finally set a town free from the tyranny of corrupt men and the complicit silence of neighbors who had chosen comfort over conscience. The bread thief had become something she had never dared imagine, a catalyst for justice and a partner in building something worth protecting. And the man who had helped her had found something he thought lost forever, a reason to stop running toward vengeance and start building toward redemption. The frontier was still a hard place, and there would always be those who sought to exploit the weak and defenseless. But in Cold Creek, at least, the balance had shifted toward something better. The bakery would provide more than bread. It would offer hope, opportunity, and the promise that no one need face their darkest moments alone. And that perhaps was the most fitting memorial that could be built for all those who had suffered under Sheriff Bridger's reign of systematized cruelty.